They say history is written by the victors, but what they never tell you is that sometimes history is not rewritten. It is erased. Completely, deliberately, and without leaving a single thread behind. And on the night of November 3rd, 1892, in a forgotten government compound buried deep beneath Coldwater Ridge, 12 men stepped into a windowless chamber for a meeting that never appeared in any ledger, any archive, any official transcript. And those 12 men, including a federal judge, a railway magnate, 2 military officers, and several civilians tied to a scandal no newspaper was allowed to print, were never seen again. Not dead, not missing, not declared fugitives. Just gone, swallowed by a room that shouldn't have existed and a night that authorities insist never happened. The only reason we even know the story survived at all is because of a single maintenance worker, Elias Hart, who kept a private notebook hidden inside the wall of his boarding house, writing in fear every night as he watched the events unfold, like an encroaching storm he couldn't escape. He wrote that the compound had been built under a false mining project, using convicts as laborers who also disappeared once construction ended. He wrote that the corridor to that secret room smelled of cold iron and wet stone, even in summer. And he wrote that on the final night, just hours before the vanishing, he heard something behind the steel door, something he later described as a second set of footsteps shadowing the first, like a man walking beside his own ghost. Elias claimed the 12 men did not go willingly. They were brought in under the guise of signing a sealed compromise over a disputed land seizure case that threatened to expose political bribery at the highest level. But the room they entered, he insisted, was not a conference chamber. It was a vault, reinforced like a prison cell and fitted with a circular floor plate that vibrated faintly, as if something beneath it was breathing. He wrote that a generator on the lower level was running that night, louder than he'd ever heard it, and that the engineer who normally oversaw it had been sent home early under a strange pretense. Elias also recorded seeing a man he didn't recognize, tall, wearing a long coat despite the warm weather, and walking with a polished cane he never used for support. The man stopped at the junction of the underground hallway, stared straight at Elias without blinking, and tapped his cane once on the stone floor. Elias wrote that he felt his bones vibrate, his vision blurred, and when he looked again, the man was already gone. What shook him even more was the moment. Around 11:56 p.m., when the entire compound lost power for exactly 6 seconds. No more. No less. In those 6 seconds, Elias said he heard screaming from the vault, 12 voices, overlapping, desperate, cut short by a low, mechanical hum that rose from the floor, like the sound of a train just before it bursts from a tunnel. When the lights came back on, the hallway was filled with dust, as if something had collapsed inside the room, but nothing had. The door stood wide open, the floor plate was still vibrating, and the chamber was empty. The men, their coats, their hats, the documents they brought, everything was gone. Elias wrote that the smell inside the room was unbearable. A mix of burnt copper and cold air from a cave that had never seen sunlight. Moments later, soldiers arrived, sealed the door, and confiscated every notebook, every key, every badge he had. But they missed the one diary he wedged behind rotten plaster in his attic. That diary revealed the most disturbing detail. A column of footprints in the dust on the chamber floor. 13 sets, not 12. 13, one set more than the number of men who entered. And all 13 sets ended abruptly at the center of the room. No return prints, no exit. Just a perfect circle of nothingness where history itself seemed to stop existing. Elias Hart didn't sleep for 3 nights after the disappearance, not because he didn't want to, but because every time he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear that low humming rising from under the compound again, pulsing through the floorboards of his boarding house as if the machine, or whatever it was, had not stopped working even though all 12 men were no longer there to hear it. He wrote that the soldiers locked down the site by morning, replacing the familiar guards with a new, silent group who spoke in short, coded phrases and carried rifles without serial numbers. Elias recognized none of them. Their boots were polished, their jackets unmarked, and their faces expressionless, as if they'd been briefed to forget the idea of empathy. The townspeople were told an accidental cave-in had occurred underground, and no unauthorized personnel were allowed near the mining area until further notice. though everyone in Coldwater Ridge knew the mine had not produced a single ounce of ore since the day it opened. But rumors spread fast, faster than the officials expected. Shopkeepers reported seeing wagons arriving at dawn carrying large crates stamped with government seals. 2 nurses at the district hospital whispered that they were ordered to prepare beds for extraction injuries. Yet no injured workers ever arrived. What shook Elias was not the soldiers or the lies. It was the sound he heard on the second night, a hollow knocking that echoed through the ventilation ducts of his quarters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. As if someone, or something, was stepping from the other side of a wall miles thick. Miles thick. He tried convincing himself it was only pipes expanding in the cold, but he wrote that the rhythm was too deliberate, too intentional, like a coded signal he wasn't meant to understand. By the next morning, the compound supervisor, a man known for his gruff voice and hatred of paperwork, was seen leaving in a carriage with his head lowered, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The same day, 3 of the workers Elias had known for years were escorted out by soldiers and never allowed to return. When he asked one guard where they were taken, the man only muttered, "There is no record of them being here." That phrase haunted Elias more than anything. No record, no presence, no proof of existence. It mirrored exactly what had been done to the 12 vanished men. As the hours passed, Elias began piecing together the clues he'd been collecting in secret. The floor plate that vibrated, the generator that roared louder that night, the unknown man with the cane, the 13 sets of footprints, and a faint, metallic residue on the walls that didn't match any known machinery. He realized something horrifying. Whatever happened in that chamber was not an accident, nor was it the result of a simple machine malfunction. It was planned, rehearsed, and executed with purpose. And if the 13th set of footprints belonged to someone, or something, that hadn't entered the room with the others, then something else had been inside the chamber waiting for them. Something that required power, secrecy, and silence. Elias described a growing feeling of being watched, especially when he walked near the old service elevator that led to the deepest level of the compound. He said the air around it felt colder, heavier, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. At one point, he stood near the shaft and heard what he swore was breathing, a slow inhale, a slower exhale, echoing up the darkness. He reported it to a shift captain, but instead of checking the elevator, the captain warned him to stop asking questions unless he wanted to join the others. That sentence chilled Elias to the spine because the captain said it so casually, so normally, as if people disappearing into thin air was now part of the daily schedule. Later that day, a piece of paper was slipped under Elias's door. No name, no signature. No name, no signature. Just a single sentence handwritten in ink darker than anything he had ever seen. The room is not done. Elias didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But he felt a certainty forming in his gut, a dread so strong it made his hands tremble. Whatever had taken those 12 men was not confined to the chamber. It could reach beyond it, and it was still hungry. Elias spent the next day pretending to work while secretly watching every corridor, every shadow, every movement of the soldiers who now acted less like guards and more like men stationed at a place they feared but could not abandon. And he noticed something unnerving. None of them ever walked past the vault room alone. They always moved in pairs, their steps quickening whenever they neared the sealed steel door, and their eyes avoided the circular mark on the floor where the 13th set of footprints had ended. By evening, a new order came down. No lanterns were to be lit on the lower level after midnight. Darkness, it seemed, was being enforced. Elias didn't understand why until the third night, when he disobeyed the order and carried a small lantern into the hallway outside the vault, desperate to prove he was imagining the faint hum he swore still came from under the floor. But as the glow of the flame brushed across the walls, he saw something he had never seen before. Thin scratches in the steel door, long and curved, as if something with claws had dragged across it from the inside. He leaned in closer, holding his breath, and noticed the metal wasn't just scratched. It was warped, bent outward, like tremendous pressure had pushed from the chamber toward the hallway, trying to escape. He staggered back, and that was when he felt it, a change in the air. A sudden coldness that swept through the corridor like a breath from a crypt. The flame flickered violently. The hum beneath the floor grew louder, vibrating through the soles of his boots, and for a brief, terrifying second, he heard what sounded like voices, muffled, distant, overlapping in whispers that rose and fell like men pleading through water. He dropped the lantern, its glass shattering across the stone floor, and the whispers stopped instantly, as if the darkness had swallowed them whole. Elias fled, but when he returned to his quarters, he found his door slightly ajar despite locking it earlier. On his table, placed neatly at the center, was another note written in that same dark ink. You heard them. That night, Elias didn't dare sleep, instead sitting with his back against the wall, clutching the wrench he kept for maintenance work. But the knocking returned. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, and this time the sound came not from the ventilation ducts but from underneath his bed. He froze. The knocking grew slower, deeper, as if whatever was beneath him was getting closer to the floorboards. Ooh. Oh. Elias forced himself to move the bed aside, expecting to see rats or loose pipes. But the wooden boards beneath were warm to the touch, as if heat was rising from the earth below. He pressed his ear to the floor and instantly regretted it. He heard breathing. Steady, patient, as though someone lay just on the other side of the wood, matching their breaths to his. He scrambled back, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. At dawn, he went straight to the one person he believed might listen. The old records clerk, Margaret Hale, who had worked in the compound since its earliest days and knew every blueprint, every rumor, every whisper that had circulated over the years. When he found her, she looked unusually pale, her hands trembling as she packed documents into a crate. Before he even asked a question, she said, "They changed the plans. Elias." The room wasn't meant to be built that deep. Confused and shaking, he begged her to explain, but she simply handed him a rolled-up sheet of weathered paper and whispered, "This is the original design. Whatever is under that chamber, it isn't man-made." Elias unrolled the blueprint and felt the blood drain from his face. The original drawings showed a simple storage room on level 3, nowhere near the cavernous depth where the real chamber now stood. Someone had altered the plans, dug deeper, built something massive beneath the earth, something with a circular lift plate and reinforced walls, and they had done it without the knowledge of the original engineers. Margaret leaned closer and said, "Before they sealed the old archives, we found survey reports from the excavation teams. They discovered an opening, an ancient cavity in the rock, but the foreman filed it as a natural hollow." She shook her head. But natural hollows don't have straight edges, Elias." That was when the truth began to form in his mind, a jagged, impossible truth that made his skin crawl. The chamber wasn't built to contain the men. It was built to contain something else, something that had been waiting long before the compound existed. Elias didn't know what terrified him more, the idea that something ancient had been discovered under Coldwater Ridge, or the possibility that the government had known about it and decided to build a secret chamber directly on top of it, like a lid on a boiling pot. The blueprint Margaret gave him felt heavier than paper, as though it carried the weight of every vanished man, every silenced witness, every note written in shaking hands. As he stared at the altered plans, he realized a horrifying detail. The floor plate in the chamber wasn't part of the original design. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. It had been added later, drawn in by someone with no name, no signature, no engineering stamp, just a series of cryptic measurements and a single word written in the margins. A convergence. Elias didn't understand the meaning, but Margaret did. He saw it in her eyes. She told him the excavation crew that dug deeper than planned had reported strange readings in the rock, magnetic anomalies, unnatural temperature fluctuations, and a low-frequency vibration that made their tools shake even when the air was still. 2 workers claimed they heard voices coming from the fissure they opened, while others insisted they saw movement inside the darkness, like shadows shifting against a wall. The foreman dismissed it as exhaustion, but within a week, 3 of the crew refused to return to the site and were promptly reassigned hundreds of miles away. Margaret whispered that she tried to file reports, but they were removed from the archive the same night she wrote them. Someone was watching everything. Someone was controlling every word that entered or left that compound. Elias asked her what she thought was beneath the chamber, but she hesitated for a long moment, as if speaking the truth might summon it. Finally, she said, "Some structures are built to protect people from the outside. Others are built to protect the outside from what's inside." Those words lodged themselves deep into Elias's chest like splinters of ice, and suddenly he realized he was in far more danger than he had understood. Before he could ask more, footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy, synchronized, the boots of soldiers. Margaret stuffed the rest of her papers into the crate and whispered urgently, "You can't stay here. They're already watching you. Go to the lower workshop and act like you're fixing the generator. Don't speak to anyone. Don't look back." Elias obeyed, slipping out through the rear door as the soldiers entered the clerical office, their expressions grim and their voices sharp. He made his way down to the lower workshop, but the air there felt wrong. Thick, electric. The generator was still humming, louder than ever, almost struggling now, as if it was being pushed beyond its limits. As Elias approached, he saw something on the metal casing. A smear of dark residue, thick and oily, glowing faintly as if reacting to the heat. He touched it with the tip of a screwdriver, and the substance curled like smoke, retreating from the metal. That's when he heard the whisper again. Not from the generator, not from the ducts, but from behind him. He spun around and saw nothing but shadows dancing along the stone walls. Yet the whisper persisted, rising like a distant chant, a dozen overlapping voices repeating a single phrase he couldn't quite make out. Fear surged through him. He backed away slowly, but his heel hit something on the floor. A shoe, polished, expensive, the kind the vanished men had worn. Only this one was split open at the side, as though something had torn through it from the inside. Elias stumbled away, unable to breathe. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw movement at the top. 3 soldiers descending, their faces tense, their hands gripping their rifles. But they didn't seem to be coming for him. They moved past him toward the generator room, scanning the shadows as if hunting something that had escaped. One of them muttered, "We're too late." Another whispered, "Cross the plate." Elias didn't know what that meant, but the third soldier's voice chilled him to the core. "Seal the lower level. If it got out, level 1 won't be safe by morning." Panic struck Elias like a blow. Something had escaped the chamber. Something that shouldn't have existed at all. Let's dream to have existed at all. And if it was loose inside the compound, then every man, woman, and child in Coldwater Ridge was in danger. As Elias stumbled back up the stairs, he felt the temperature shift again. Another cold breath sweeping through the hallway. The lanterns flickered, the floor vibrated, and from the depths below, something answered. Elias didn't know what terrified him more, the idea that something ancient had been discovered under Coldwater Ridge, or the possibility that the government had known about it, and decided to build a secret chamber directly on top of it, like a lid on a boiling pot. The blueprint Margaret gave him felt heavier than paper, as though it carried the weight of every vanished man. Every silenced witness, every note written in shaking hand. As he stared at the altered plans, he realized a horrifying detail. The floor plate in the chamber wasn't part of the original design. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. It had been added later, drawn in by someone with no name, no signature, no engineering stamp, just a series of cryptic measurements and a single word written in the margins. Convergence. Elias didn't understand the meaning, but Margaret did. He saw it in her eyes. She told him the excavation crew that dug deeper than planned had reported strange readings in the rock, magnetic anomalies, unnatural temperature fluctuations, and a low-frequency vibration that made their tools shake even when the air was still. 2 workers claimed they heard voices coming from the fissure they opened, while others insisted they saw movement inside the darkness, like shadows shifting against a wall. The foreman dismissed it as exhaustion. But within a week, 3 of the crew refused to return to the site and were promptly reassigned hundreds of miles away. Margaret whispered that she tried to file reports, but they were removed from the archive. The same night, she wrote them. Someone was watching everything. Someone was controlling every word that entered or left that compound. Elias asked her what she thought was beneath the chamber, but she hesitated for a long moment, as if speaking the truth might summon it. Finally, she said, "Some structures are built to protect people from the outside. Others are built to protect the outside from what's inside." Those words lodged themselves deep into Elias's chest like splinters of ice. And suddenly he realized he was in far more danger than he had understood. Oh! Before he could ask more, footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy, synchronized, the boots of soldiers. Margaret stuffed the rest of her papers into the crate and whispered urgently, "You can't stay here. They're already watching you. Go to the lower workshop and act like you're fixing the generator. Don't speak to anyone. Don't look back. Elias obeyed, slipping out through the rear door as the soldiers entered the clerical office, their expressions grim and their voices sharp. He made his way down to the lower workshop, but the air there felt wrong, thick, electric. The generator was still humming, louder than ever, almost struggling now, as if it was being pushed beyond its limits. As Elias approached, he saw something on the metal casing. A smear of dark residue, thick and oily, glowing faintly as if reacting to the heat. He touched it with the tip of a screwdriver, and the substance curled like smoke, retreating from the metal. That's when he heard the whisper again, not from the generator, not from the ducts, but from behind him. He spun around and saw nothing but shadows dancing along the stone walls. Yet the whisper persisted, rising like a distant chant, a dozen overlapping voices repeating a single phrase he couldn't quite make out. Fear surged through him. He backed away slowly, but his heel hit something on the floor. A shoe, polished, expensive, the kind the vanished men had worn. Only this one was split open at the side as though something had torn through it from the inside. Elias stumbled away, unable to breathe. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw movement at the top, 3 soldiers descending, their faces tense, their hands gripping their rifles. But they didn't seem to be coming for him. They moved past him toward the generator room, scanning the shadows as if hunting something that had escaped. One of them muttered, "We're too late." Another whispered, "It crossed the place." Elias didn't know what that meant, but the third soldier's voice chilled him to the core. "Seal the lower level. If it got out, level 1 won't be safe by morning." Panic struck Elias like a blow. Something had escaped the chamber. Something that shouldn't have existed at all. And if it was loose inside the compound, then every man, woman, and child in Coldwater Ridge was in danger. As Elias stumbled back up the stairs, he felt the temperature shift again, another cold breath sweeping through the hallway. The lanterns flickered, the floor vibrated. And from the depths below, something answered. Elias didn't remember running, only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding against his ears as he fled up the staircase. But when he reached the second-level landing, the air around him shifted again, another cold wave sweeping through the stone corridor. Yeah, thick enough to make his breath fog as if he had stepped out into winter. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. And for a moment he heard nothing but the distant clatter of boots and shouted orders echoing from deeper inside the compound. Then slowly, the hallway lights began to flicker one by one, each bulb humming before dimming into a weak orange glow. He could sense something moving behind the walls, like a vibration that didn't follow any rhythm he recognized. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. So, Elias forced himself to calm down long enough to sneak back toward the clerical offices, hoping Margaret was still there. When he arrived, the door was half open, papers scattered across the floor, as if someone had torn through the room looking for evidence. The crate Margaret had been packing was gone. So was she. A single page remained on the desk, held down by a rusted paperweight shaped like a lantern. Elias picked it up, his hands trembling. It wasn't a report or a blueprint. It was a sketch, rough, rushed, drawn in charcoal, but unmistakable. A circular chamber, a platform at its center. And beneath the platform, a dark void filled with long, slender shapes reaching upward like twisted fingers. Elias's stomach twisted. Before he could study it further, a sharp metallic bang sounded from the hallway, for fists slamming against steel. Then another, and another. Slowly, methodically, as if whatever was knocking wanted to be sure he heard it. Elias dropped the sketch, backing away from the door. The banging grew louder, closer, until it was directly outside the office. But the instant he reached for a wrench on the table, the noise stopped. Silence filled the hallway, heavy and suffocating. He risked a glance around the doorframe and froze. There were footprints on the floor. Wet, dark, smeared in uneven patterns, leading away from the office and stretching down the corridor toward the stairwell. But what made Elias's heart stop was not their presence. It was their shape. They weren't made by boots. They weren't made by bare feet. They were long, thin, almost skeletal, with too many joints and a drag mark behind each step, as if something heavy trailed along the floor. Panic clawed at his throat. He forced himself to follow the prints, knowing the soldiers would be sweeping the compound. If they found him now, they might kill him for what he'd seen. At the stairwell, the prints suddenly stopped, just ended, abruptly, in the middle of the floor. No turn, no fade, no continuation. as if if it was a creature, had simply vanished into thin air. Elias didn't have time to wonder how, because from below he heard shouting followed by gunfire. Short bursts, then screams, loud, desperate, abruptly cut off. A tremor rattled the railings. Dust drifted from the ceiling like ash. Something was climbing. He heard it. Not footsteps, not boots, but a scraping, like claws dragging against stone. Moving upward, fast. Elias bolted toward the maintenance tunnels, the only part of the compound he knew better than anyone else. The tunnels were narrow, damp, lit by inconsistent lamps that cast long shadows across the pipes. He ran until he reached a rusted hatch leading to an old ventilation shaft. It was barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through, but Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled himself inside, sliding the hatch shut behind him just as the scraping noise entered the tunnel outside. Through the thin metal, he heard it, slow breathing, deliberate, as if sniffing the air, searching. Elias held his breath until his lungs burned. The breathing grew louder, closer, then stopped. For several agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then the metal hatch dented inward, bending as though a hand, or something like a hand, pressed against it from the outside. Elias bit down on his sleeve to stifle a scream. Another dent formed beside the first. And then, just as suddenly, the pressure disappeared. He heard the scraping retreating down the tunnel, moving away, hunting something else. Elias didn't dare move for several minutes. When he finally crawled deeper into the shaft, the only light came from tiny cracks between the metal plates, illuminating the dark air like thin blades of moonlight. Every part of him shook. The compound was no longer just a place where men vanished. Something had awakened beneath it. Something the chamber had been built to contain, and now it was free. Elias crawled through the narrow ventilation shaft until his knees and elbows felt raw. But he didn't stop until the scraping sounds faded completely, replaced by the low rumble of distant alarms echoing through the compound. Red emergency lights flashed dimly through gaps in the metal, casting bursts of color across his shaking hands. He had never seen those lights used, not once in all his years there. The last time anyone even mentioned them was in an old emergency manual that warned the red alarms were only to be activated if boiler containment integrity is compromised. Elias didn't know what containment meant at the time, but now he understood all too well. When he finally reached a junction where the shaft widened slightly, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. His head throbbed. His throat felt tight from the dust. But the worst sensation was the constant vibration in the metal around him, like the compound itself was trembling. Something below was moving, slowly, methodically, with immense weight. He pressed his hand to the metal plate and felt it pulse, like a heartbeat. Before he could gather his thoughts, a faint voice echoed through the shaft, urgent, whispering his name. Elias, can you hear me? He froze. It sounded like Margaret. He crawled toward the sound, moving through the shaft until he reached a broken grate overlooking a storage corridor. Margaret stood below, breathless and shaken, clutching a lantern that flickered with every tremor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. When she spotted him, she motioned frantically. Come down. Quickly. Elias kicked the grate loose and dropped to the floor. Margaret grabbed his arm before he could ask anything. There's no time. They're evacuating the north wing. Whatever came out of that chamber, her voice cracked. It killed 6 men already. They can't even identify the bodies. Before Elias could respond, an ear-splitting metallic scream rang through the corridor, as if steel was being torn apart somewhere nearby. The lights overhead flickered violently, buzzing, stuttering, then stabilizing at half power. Margaret pulled Elias into a side room and slammed the door behind them. She whispered, I saw the soldiers barricading the east shaft. They kept shouting that level 4 is compromised. If level 3 goes next, the entire structure will collapse. Elias stared at her. What did they release? Margaret swallowed hard. It wasn't supposed to be opened. The chamber, it wasn't a meeting room. It was a seal over the cavity they found. Her voice shook. And the cavity wasn't empty. She reached into her coat and pulled out a second drawing, more detailed than the first. It showed a cavern shaped like a massive rib cage with long spine structures embedded in the rock. At the center was a void, perfectly circular, lined with symbols he didn't recognize. The excavation team had labeled it simply, Unknown Origin. Elias felt his stomach twist. You think they uncovered something? Alive? Margaret hesitated, then whispered, Not alive the way we understand it. Before he could question her, another tremor shook the building, this one strong enough to make dust rain from the ceiling. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the walls, almost like a bellow, too low to be human. Margaret pulled Elias toward a maintenance ladder leading down to a network of abandoned service tunnels. We need to get out before they seal the upper levels. Elias climbed down first, gripping the rungs tightly as the air grew colder with each step, the darkness thicker. At the bottom, they entered a long, narrow tunnel that smelled of damp stone and rust. The ground was uneven, scraped as though something massive had been dragged through recently. Margaret's steps faltered when she saw the marks, her voice barely a whisper. It came through here. Elias wanted to turn back, but the ceiling above them groaned as another impact shook the compound. They had no choice. They ran through the tunnel until they reached a junction where a rusted sign pointed toward an old blast door labeled Emergency Exit 2. Margaret rushed to the control panel and turned the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me," she shouted. Elias threw his weight against the wheel, and slowly, agonizingly, the door creaked open. A blast of cold air swept into the tunnel, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, the outside world. But just as they stepped toward freedom, a sound echoed behind them. Not scraping, not footsteps. Something worse. Breathing, heavy, slow, hungry. Margaret grabbed Elias's hand, pulling him through the door, but as they crossed the threshold, Elias risked a glance back, just one, and saw, in the faint red emergency glow, a shape emerging from the darkness. Tall, thin, too thin, too thin. Its limbs were long, jointed in the wrong places. And its eyes. There were too many, all of them reflecting the red light like mirrors. Margaret screamed, "Run!" and they did. The snow had started falling again by the time Ethan reached the ridge overlooking the abandoned mining town, its crooked roofs barely visible under the rising fog. The air felt heavier here, as if the land itself carried memories no one wanted to disturb. He tightened his grip on the old map he'd taken from Caldwell Hall, the same map that had been hidden behind the plaster wall in the archive room. A map marked with a faint red cross labeled "Only." Labeled "Only," where they waited. The wind stung his eyes as he descended the slope, boots crunching through frozen weeds, each step echoing louder than it should have in the empty valley. The closer he got, the more the silence changed. It wasn't true silence anymore. It was something thin, trembling, like a breath being held. His flashlight flickered across shattered windows and rusted metal signs until it landed on one building still standing tall, despite the years, the old superintendent's cabin. The wooden door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying gently, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Ethan approached carefully, the boards groaning under his weight, and pushed the door. It creaked open with a sound like a long, tired exhale. The smell inside hit him immediately. Dust, oil, and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers long crumbled to powder. His flashlight beam shook as it swept across the room. An overturned chair, a lantern blackened with soot, a desk littered with papers too brittle to touch. And on the far wall, carved deep into the wood, was the symbol he had come to fear. A circle with a single vertical slash. The same mark from Caldwell Hall, the same mark burned into the photographs of the missing men. But here, it looked fresher, newer, almost as if someone had carved it recently. Ethan moved closer, tracing the grooves with his gloved finger. The lines were sharp, the wood dust still clinging to the edges. His stomach tightened. Someone had been here, not a century ago. Now, his light drifted downward and froze. There were footprints on the dusty floor, 12 sets, all leading deeper into the cabin, all perfectly aligned, none returning. Ethan felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He followed them slowly, the cabin seeming to stretch unnaturally with each step, the hallway narrowing until he felt the walls pressing closer. Something was humming faintly, so soft he thought it might be his own pulse. But the deeper he went, the louder it grew, a low resonance like distant chanting or a vibration under the floorboard. The hallway ended at a door sealed with wooden boards nailed crudely but urgently, as though someone had been desperate to keep something inside. The humming stopped. The silence thickened, colder than the air outside. Ethan reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed one of the boards. It fell off immediately, as if the nails had never been driven in tightly. A chill rolled across the back of his neck. He didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, he forced himself to look around the small entryway. That was when he noticed the handwritten note pinned beneath a rusted nail. A scrap of yellowed paper, edges burned, ink smeared with age or fear. He lifted it gently. The handwriting was uneven but legible. If you are reading this, then the room has opened for you too. Do not trust the silence. It hears everything. We tried to run. We tried to warn them. But the truth is not something the council lets go. And the room never forgives. Ethan's breath hitched. Beneath the main message was one more line, written in a different hand, thinner, shakier, almost childlike. They are still here. They never left. They just learned to wait. The lantern in the corner flickered, though Ethan hadn't touched it. A slow creak echoed through the cabin, not from the hallway behind him, from inside the sealed room. His pulse pounded as he stepped back, the old boards of the floor seeming to shift under his weight. Something pressed once, softly, against the nailed door from the other side. Then again, louder, more impatient. Ethan staggered away, gripping the note, his breath fogging in short bursts. He backed into the desk, scattering old papers to the floor. One landed at his feet, half buried under dust. Foyed under dust. He bent to pick it up, and when he turned it over, his blood ran cold. It was a photograph. A grainy, aged image of 12 men standing outside Caldwell Hall, but someone had drawn the symbol across their faces in red ink. And beneath the picture, written in the same shaky handwriting, were 4 words that twisted Ethan's stomach into knots. Words that made the knocking on the door behind him stop completely. We know you can. The storm outside the cabin seemed to twist itself around the wooden frame like a living threat, shaking loose flakes of old paint as Ethan stood frozen in place, the photograph trembling in his grip. His breath came out in sharp, uneven bursts, fogging the cold air as a soft thump echoed from behind the sealed door. Once, then again, harder, as though something inside had just discovered it wasn't alone anymore. He stepped back, boots crunching on broken glass and fallen papers, trying to steady his thoughts, but the room around him seemed to pulse with a strange, rhythmic vibration that didn't match the storm outside. It felt like a heartbeat. Steady, deep, ancient. Ethan crouched to gather the rest of the scattered documents, and a folded map slid from beneath the desk. When he opened it, his throat tightened. This wasn't just a map of Caldwell Hall. It was a layout of the original property from 1891, showing corridors and basement rooms long sealed off and officially demolished. One room was circled in heavy black ink, the Vault of Corrections, and beneath it a handwritten note, where truth is rewritten, where witnesses disappear. Ethan's pulse hammered harder. He whispered, "This is why they were hiding, why they ran," but the words died on his tongue as something scraped slowly across the other side of the sealed door, a sound like fingertips or nails dragging along old wood. The boards trembled. Dust fell in thin streams. Ethan inched backward until he reached the far wall, flashlight beam jittering across aged wallpaper that had peeled into long, curling strips. Then a sudden knock, sharp, deliberate, made him flinch. Not loud, but commanding, as if offering him a choice instead of demanding entry. Ethan swallowed hard and raised the flashlight, its beam sweeping once more across the room until it landed on something he hadn't noticed before, a pair of boots near the corner, old, worn, still arranged neatly side by side. And beside them, an overcoat hung on a rusted hook, the fabric untouched by dust as though someone had hung it there hours ago, not decades. Ethan stepped closer, dread settling like ice under his ribs. Inside the coat pocket was a small, leather-bound book, identical to the ones the 12 men had carried. He opened it, flipping past water-stained pages filled with hurried confessions, cryptic symbols, and frantic warnings. The last page stopped him cold. It wasn't written by one of the 12. It was written in clean ink, fresh enough that it hadn't even smudged. And the message was short. "If you found this place, they already know your name." For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. His hand shook violently as the cabin lights flickered. Though no electricity had ever run through the building, a hiss of cold air slithered beneath the sealed door. Then everything fell silent, completely silent. The storm, the tapping, even the wind outside, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. Ethan backed away from the door, every instinct screaming to run, to flee, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But before he could take another step, the flashlight dimmed, then surged brightly, illuminating the far corner of the room, and something was standing there, just a silhouette, still, motionless, human-shaped, watching him. Ethan froze, unable to move, unable to move, unable to speak. His pulse pounded so loudly he felt it echo through his skull. The silhouette didn't move forward. It didn't reach out. It simply raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the sealed door, as though giving him a message he couldn't refuse. Refuse. Ethan shook his head, whispering, No, I'm not opening it." But before he could finish the sentence, a voice seeped through the cracks in the wood, a voice layered with many tones at once. 12. Maybe more, speaking in perfect unison. "The truth is waiting, and now so are we." Ethan stumbled back, colliding with the desk, sending papers flying like startled birds. The silhouette vanished the instant his flashlight beam flickered across it. The boards on the sealed door began to bend inward, not violently, but with slow, terrifying patience, as if whatever was inside had all the time in the world. And then, from somewhere deep beneath the cabin floor, Ethan heard footsteps, 12 pairs, ascending, slowly, deliberately, toward him. Toward him. He clutched the notebook to his chest, eyes wide, breath breaking, realizing too late that the room wasn't haunted by the missing men. It was waiting for its next witness. Ethan's heart raced as the footsteps drew closer, echoing through the cabin like a chorus of whispers folded into one monstrous voice. Each step carried weight, deliberate and heavy, pressing against the thin wooden floor as though the earth itself had risen to claim him. He backed into the far corner, clutching the leather-bound book, feeling the chill crawl up his spine as the air thickened and the shadows stretched unnaturally toward him. The lantern flickered violently, casting jagged, dancing silhouettes across the walls, making it impossible to distinguish reality from the room's dark illusions. He tried to run, but the floorboard seemed to resist, creaking under his weight as if warning him, "Don't move, don't move." The voice returned, layered, deep, impossible to ignore. "You've come this far, now witness." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to glance at the sealed door. The boards were bending inward, slowly, rhythmically, almost breathing, and as they shifted, a faint, reddish glow emanated from the gap, illuminating shapes that no human mind was meant to comprehend. Twisted forms, elongated limbs, faces too numerous for a single head, eyes glinting like black mirrors, emerged from the darkness beneath the room. They moved in a synchronized, uncanny rhythm, and Ethan realized with horror that these were the same 12 men, or rather, the vessels of something that had claimed them, their humanity consumed and twisted over time into this incomprehensible mass. The hum that had haunted him for weeks now surged into a deafening resonance, vibrating through the walls, through his bones, into the marrow of his mind. Ethan fell to his knees, trying to steady himself, but the book slipped from his hands, thudding against the floor as if landing in the presence of something sacred and profane at the same time. The entities approached silently, the floorboards beneath them imperceptibly shifting to accommodate their impossible forms. And then one of them, or perhaps all speaking as one, lifted a hand toward him. A terrible, unnatural calm filled the room, and Ethan felt a compulsion, deep in his chest, stronger than fear, stronger than instinct, stronger than reason. Step forward. He obeyed, feet moving as though guided by invisible strings. His gaze met the hollowed eyes of the first figure, and he glimpsed the centuries, long knowledge. The hidden truths erased from the world above. History itself, forbidden and rewritten, lay within those eyes, and Ethan understood. These 12 men hadn't vanished. They had been transformed, bound to the room, bound to the secrets it contained, keepers of what the living were not meant to see, and now he was chosen. He stepped closer, and the air thickened, pressing against his chest. The entities circled him, each movement slow, deliberate, each whisper layering over the last. We were erased. We endured. Now you will see. The glow from beneath the boards expanded, enveloping him in light and shadow, warmth and frost, hope and despair all at once. In that instant, Ethan understood the full horror and majesty of what the chamber had concealed. The 12 men had not merely disappeared. They had become conduits, guardians of a secret that the world above was never meant to uncover. He realized as the whispers surrounded him that the room was alive, aware, and patient. Time here was meaningless. Mortals came and went, but the room endured, and it was watching him, testing him, offering him a choice. Step in understanding or be forgotten like those who came before. Ethan's knees buckled, and the entities closed in, their forms impossibly tall, limbs bending in ways his mind refused to register. The whispering intensified, rising into a chorus of voices that spoke all at once. Do you accept the truth? His throat tightened. Sweat mingled with the cold on his face. Every instinct screamed to run, yet a part of him, deep, terrified, curious, stepped forward. And then, In the flicker of a lightning flash outside the cabin, Ethan glimpsed the center of the room. The circular floor plate, the same one that had hummed, that had vibrated beneath those 12 men, glowed like molten metal, pulsating in time with the whispers, drawing him closer. He took another step, another, and felt a pull stronger than gravity itself, guiding him to the heart of the chamber. And in that moment, Ethan understood the last, terrifying truth. Some secrets are not meant to be buried. Some rooms are not meant to be entered. And some men, once they cross the threshold, never return, not because they were taken, but because they chose to become part of the darkness that waits patiently beneath the world, silent, eternal, and all-seeing.